I'll go a little.
You help me on that.
Yeah.
If I go closer to the mic, is that better?
Yeah, I think that's okay.
Okay, I'll just move. I might have my mic closer here. So
yeah, I turned up my volume too.
That sounds good. Okay.
Okay, cool. So yeah, real pleasure and honor to have on a couple of veterans today, actually. So we have Brendan Bourdage, who is, among other things, an assistant coach at the College of William and Mary, a PhD in what, Brendan?
It's educational policy planning and leadership.
Gotcha. But you also were in the Army for a stint and served overseas and all that good stuff too, right?
Yeah, a couple stints. So had my fun.
And then also we have a retired Navy officer who was part of the SEAL teams. And then just reading through your bio, you were a commander.
Yes, I retired as a commander, yeah.
Okay. And then I guess what kind of led you to writing the book, The Attributes, was your time as being in charge of the selection process of SEAL Team 6. Is that kind of accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate.
So so you've deployed, I think I read 11 times. So you
I think 11 to Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think it was 13 or 14 total. So a lot.
you were busy. But the reason why we wanted to have you on is because of the book that you wrote called The Attributes, and I think it's a really interesting story that you tell in the book about kind of that what seemed to me to be an aha moment where you were. You had a guy that you had to bring in and cut because he didn't know necessarily how to do the job, but he could, which is what really stuck with me. And if you could just tell that story real quickly, that would be, I think, really set the table for what we're getting into here.
Yeah, of course. So at that selection, you're obviously dealing with some very talented folks who are applying to come to that selection. So you're dealing with really competent individuals already. It's not basic training by any stretch. And so when people don't make it through, you need to have reasons why that is the case. And up to the point I took over training, we didn't have very good reasons. We were saying things like, well, the guy couldn't shoot very well or couldn't do this, couldn't do that. And that didn't make sense. I mean, these are guys who, before coming to selection, had shot more rounds than most people in the military. So it felt disingenuous to them, to us, and our leadership was starting to ask questions. And so it drove me to, and I kind of got ordered to look at it and try to articulate it. And in doing so, I realized I had to kind of break performance down into more elemental factors than what we typically think. And because a lot of us typically look at performance and think of those visible things we can see, such as shooting or throwing a ball or riding a bike or stuff like that, i.e. skills. And what I had to kind of determine was, a lot of performance has to do with these intangible hidden qualities, things like adaptability and patience and situation awareness. And that drives performance at very elemental hidden levels. And so it really prompted me to start looking at both of those factors so that we could better articulate what was going on.
Gotcha. And so whatever happened to that guy? Did he get his chance to come back?
No, very few people get a chance to come back. So if you get dropped, that's usually it. I'm not even sure if there's any case. I'm sure there's a couple cases of someone's come back, but typically it doesn't happen. So, but again, the guys who don't make it through, they go back to the teams and they just they continue serving honorably. Obviously, but that was the other thing. We were facing this situation where guys who did get dropped go back to the teams and they'd feel pretty crappy about what happened and what we did, and so to their in their defense, they began to badmouth us. Right. And I don't blame them because we weren't giving them good reasons. We were just kind of treating them like they were turds, and they weren't. And so that was one of our certainly my motivating factor to try to upgrade that experience for guys. So and that was the endeavor.
And so you developed this list of attributes, which has I think I wrote down like 5 different areas, but there's 25 total attributes basically. So, how did you come to develop that list, and how did selection change after you developed that list?
Yeah, I mean, so the list of attributes is, we came up with 36 there. I wrote about 25. We now, with our organization, the work we do with teams and businesses, we have 42. And I don't think I mean, I'm always looking for more, but right now 42 is all I can kind of think of or kind of vet out. But in terms of what we did is, I put together groups and said, okay, what are those qualities we're looking for in an operator here? And I put together separate groups so they could come up with separate lists, and then I compared all the lists and was able to. And we got, I think when we collated everything, we had like 100 things, and of course then you take away that, you take out the skills, because oftentimes skills and attributes get conflated. So like, great runner is not an attribute, or good explosives guy, that's not an attribute. And so
Yes.
we had to cull out those skills and then break it down to what these attributes were. And so we came up with 36, and really for us at the time, what it did was it allowed us to change the optic from which we were observing training. We didn't have to change training at all. In fact, it was kind of a mandate that I was not allowed to change training. In the SEALs, it's always about what I did, whatever I did, that the next guy has to do, right? Whether it's basic training or the training I was running. So, and again, there was no reason to change training. The training was solid, and so, but it allowed us to change our optic of what we were seeing. So if I saw a guy now who was struggling with being able to go into a room and make accurate shots, it wasn't about him being a bad shooter. It was about him maybe not having enough situation awareness, maybe not being able to task switch fast enough. It was if someone was screwing up and the instructors were on him, and he couldn't get out, he just kept on spiraling downward, I was seeing low resilience, or not enough resilience is more accurate. And so it allowed us to really precisely delineate what we were seeing without being kind of obtuse and saying, "Well, it's just this skill or that skill." And that's really what helped a great deal.
Right. So did you find that most of the people who came to that selection, like what percentage, I guess is a better way to ask it, is have the ability but just aren't there skill wise? Yeah.
Well, it's about a 50% attrition at that place,
Uh-huh.
and that's fairly consistent. So about 50% don't make it, which again, I mean, every assessment selection process implies attrition, right? But we just needed to articulate that attrition much more accurately. So
Gotcha. And so if you kind of look at it through the lens of someone a high school kid who wants to become a college athlete,
mm-hmm.
And then we have a college coach on here as well, Brendan. Like, what percentage are you looking at skills, and then what is the percentage that you're looking at attributes, Brendan?
So I think it's pretty similar. So like in my dissertation, for instance, I talked about what are the latent factors that create belief, right? So it's not just about like motivation, or a guy who's yelling a lot. Like that's not belief, or someone saying I believe is not belief. It's about kind of these underlying things, which is what I think Rich is getting at, like trying to get to the fundamental things that you need to work on when everyone's already at a reasonably high level. So you can translate that to any level of soccer you want as well. When you get to Division I soccer, everyone can pass the ball, everyone can shoot a ball. It's other things that really create high functioning teams and high functioning members of teams. So I think mostly the way that I approach it is pretty similar to what I think Rich is talking about, in the sense that we have to find the next thing, like something that is something that we're assessing that is actually going to differentiate between athletes. Because like I said, being able to pass the ball, being able to shoot the ball doesn't really help you differentiate. So I think we're on mostly the same wavelength in terms of how we're both viewing our high performing groups.
Yeah. I was curious about something when I was reading through some of your book, and can certain attributes determine potential? So
yeah, the answer is yes. In fact, all attributes determine potential, or at least highlight potential. I always kind of say that skills show us what is, and attributes show us what could be. And so, one of the distinguishing factors, and I really appreciate Brendan's perspective on this. I don't talk about athletics as much as I do other environments, and the reason is because a lot of what I do and what I focus on is this idea of operating and in fact mastering uncertainty. This is what spec operators do. We can drop into deeply complex and chaotic environments and begin to perform. And one of the things that hooked me on attributes is that when you do that, you are running pretty much on attributes. Skills actually don't fall into the equation, because when you're in complexity and chaos, your first job is not to do. Your first job is to figure out what to do, right? So it's first I figure out or I make sense, and then I do. And where this differs from athletics is that athletics is much more of a certain environment. So I would completely agree, and I think one of the challenges in the athletic world when we talk about attributes is that athletics, you can go pretty far on just skills in athletics. But I think what Brendan is explaining, and I completely agree with, is that if you want to be the top people, like you talk about the top athletes out there, those are athletes that not only have the skill, but they have the attributes, right? There's probably a lot of football players, or quarterbacks that can throw the ball as far as Drew Brees or Tom Brady, right? But to do what Tom Brady and Drew Brees did takes attributes. And so the project becomes a little bit more complex, because in uncertainty, challenge, and stress, there almost are no skills. All you're seeing are attributes. Attributes become so visible and visceral that environments such as mine, the training environment or combat or whatever, were perfect laboratories, because it was just, oh, there it is. I mean, it's so blatantly obvious, right? But I don't think it's as obvious on the athletic field, which is, I think, the challenge that Brendan is describing. But it is quite true.
Yeah.
So if I could add in right there, the interesting thing about that, Rich, is that when we coach in college, especially, or when you're coaching in high school, you're thinking a lot about what you kind of mentioned, like what can be these athletes. Like if you're a high school athlete, can you continue your career and continue to do something you're passionate about, et cetera? And if you're a college athlete, this may be the end of the road for you athletically, depending on your level. But what kind of attributes can we help you develop that are going to then serve you well later in life? So in one sense, it's more difficult. In one sense, I think it's somewhat, you have more flexibility in the way that you develop attributes, because it's not about close with and kill. It's about, how are you going to move through your life and be successful and, enjoy things and develop and continue to develop and things like that. So I think in one sense, yes, it can be harder, but in one sense, it's more expansive. There's more you can do, I think, or you can take a broader perspective in certain ways.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty common that things get passed down from military and athletic experience, right? I mean, you guys are kind of like the crucibles to learn things and figure out how things work in intense environments. I'm not liking, saying that an athletic event and war are the same things, but it's still pretty intense environments in their own rights. I mean,
yeah, man, it's pretty hot out here, so it's tough.
Yeah, it is a hot day in Southeast Virginia, that's for sure. So let's I know that we have a hard stop in about a half an hour, and I know that the reason why I wanted to have Brendan on with you, Rich, is because of just a self-efficacy discussion. And I read that portion of your book, and it really clicked for me, like how important it is to be self-efficacious as you whatever endeavor you're taking on and whatever you're trying to master. I think that it's important to bring a level of high level of that. And I want you to kind of describe, the way you do in your book, what self-efficacy is. And then Brendan, please, I want you guys to, have a good conversation around that, because I think it'll be pretty educational.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, sir, I want to. I'm really excited to hear Brendan's take on this. I mean, I've not done a dissertation on it, so I'm going to go with a generic layman's version here. But the way I defined self-efficacy after doing some research on it was this idea that it is a first of all, self-efficacy often has to do with it often has to do with kind of singular goals or objectives. Like there's a project, there's some sort of project or something to do or accomplish. And it's a kind of a combination of this, of kind of three things. It's a combination of confidence, which is I know I can do this. It has initiative, which I have the ability to get started. That's kind of the self starter aspect, and then this kind of realistic optimism that as I go through it, I'll figure it out along the way. And I think those three things are what describe self-efficacy or the self-efficacious person. Because if you don't have, if you're in absence of one of those three things or two of those three things, then you're not really, you're not really moving, right? I can be confident that I can do something all day long. If I don't have the initiative to start or the optimism that I can figure it along the way, nothing's going to happen. It's inert. I can have initiative, right? I can get started all day long. If I don't have the confidence or the optimism, then I'm just going to have frenetic energy. I'm not going to really go where I need to go. And then finally, I can have optimism. But if I have just optimism and no confidence and initiative, then well, that's just pie in the sky thinking. And so you have to combine the three to actually make the self-efficacious person. So as an attribute, that's just you see it more in certain people than you do others. And so that's my very layman general definition. I'm excited to hear what Brendan thinks about that whole thing.
Yeah, I actually haven't heard it described in that three-pronged way. My study focused a lot on how to develop, like what are the sources of efficacy belief, whether it's a individual or collective efficacy, and then how do you set conditions in your environment to develop those beliefs. And so I like that you mentioned the idea that it's often a very specific task or goal that you set for yourself, because one of the biggest things that I came across in my research was just the idea of how context specific efficacy beliefs are. So one of the examples that is often thrown out there is like, you can have a ton of confidence in your ability to drive a car, but if I put you in downtown San Francisco and you're looking at a 60-degree upslope and driving a stick, you might not feel great about your ability. Even though you might be great at driving a car, the context matters, right? And so I can feel really physically confident in who I am right now. That does not mean I am ready for selection.
Right.
And those types of things are really important to understand, that someone who, like you said, someone who's just confident, can often project an ability to accomplish a task. But if they don't have that motivation or the initiative, like you mentioned, and they don't have a realistic perspective on who they are and what their skills are at that moment or what their attributes are at that moment, it's going to be very hard for them to sustain any kind of belief. And that applies not only to individuals, but to groups. So I like that three-prong approach, and I'm probably going to steal that and start talking about it a little bit, because I think it really fleshes out the idea of once you've identified sources and you figured out how you want to develop those sources, then we start getting into that idea of assessing and saying, well, we've done all these things and we don't have the belief that we think we should. So which of the three prongs is missing, which I think could be a really useful tool.
Yeah. Well, I'm breathing a decided sigh of relief, because someone who has studied it way more than I have agrees. So I appreciate that. I'm glad it resonates.
That wasn't a move to trap you, believe me. I thought that it could be. Yeah. So you used, I think you did use a driving example in your book, actually, where you were in Ireland.
I used it. I can't remember where I used it.
It might not have been self-efficacy.
Yeah, I think I did. I mean, I use car examples quite a lot, but yeah, I think that was like, I think if you, in fact, I did. If you get in a car and you're just confident you can drive a car but have no initiative, you're not going anywhere. If you just have initiative and no confidence or optimism, that's like the kid who mashes the accelerator with no direction to go, right? And then if you have optimism, you'll just sit in the car and go nowhere. So yeah, but yeah, it is funny.
The story that you kind of framed this around was sounded like a friend of yours, Sandy Travis, who had a remarkable story, actually. Maybe you can jump into that a little bit and describe her story, and I'm sure there's more to the story at this point.
Yeah, well, she's a remarkable woman, and and local. So she's around here, but she went through several big pivots in her life, and I think and again, you have to forgive me. It's been a while since I've refreshed myself, but one of the first pivots was her just having to she got a divorce and she completely had to change her entire lifestyle. She moved somewhere else and just picked up and began a new lifestyle. And then the other one that's kind of highlighted is her fight with cancer, which she really kind of attacked in a very positive way. And she kind of looked at it as, hey, this is something this is a challenge I get to do. And she had the confidence, the initiative, and the optimism. She knew she was going to get through it, and she saw it was almost that growth mindset thing.
Right.
And so she's just someone. She was someone in my immediate experience, and a friend that I could use as an example of this idea of the pivot, and that pivot. I mean, it's really those in life we have those pivots, and the pivot is kind of the extreme example of needing to be self-efficacious, but your life is just, it takes a different direction, and it's either a choice or it's something that happens to you. But both require, for success, both require efficacy. And so I think we should all be aware of our pivots, because they're going to happen, but also I think part of growth is to sometimes just pick a new pivot, which Sandy is also an example of, just making a decision. And most military, in fact, all military folks who transition from the military are deliberately choosing a pivot. And so she had worked with me I had worked with her actually at a SEAL. It was a transition course to help SEALs and special warfare folks transition into civilian life. So she was such a remarkable example of this pivot, and the idea that, yes, as you transition from the military, it's a huge pivot. You're literally, in many cases, unless you're going to take a civilian job for the government at the place you previously worked, which is not, it's a different kind of pivot, but not as extreme. You're jumping off one mountain and into the valley, and you're going to decide to climb up a new mountain, and that is a pivot, and that takes self-efficacy.
And pivot doesn't mean failure. So like if
Oh
you
no, yeah, no, yeah,
if you're again framing it in what we're talking about, I mean, it's the kid who had the goal of being a Division I athlete, let's say, and it pans out that they go to a D3 school, and so that's a pivot, right? I mean, so I think just having the wherewithal and the self-awareness to understand and be honest with yourself, right?
Yeah. Well, pivots, I will say this: it's not really it's not a useful endeavor to judge pivots in any way, positively or negatively. They're simply a change in direction, and it's upon you to actually embark upon that new direction. And set judgment aside. It's kind of like good luck, bad luck type thing. You just, hey, this is what's happening. Either if it's happening to me, it's happening. There's nothing I can do to stop it, so I have to perform, or I'm deliberately making this pivot, right? But to place judgment on either way is not a positive endeavor. So
yeah, you just kind of I think I made a note that you just kind of have to accept them, right? You accept hiccups, and that's just part of the process and journey. Yeah. How do you define kind of, so you have this goal, and you approach it with self-efficacy, but sometimes those can just kind of be hubris, right? I mean, it's how do you delineate between realism and a dream, so to speak?
in terms of the goals we set, is that what you're thinking? Yeah.
Yeah. And when do you come to the again, I mean, I didn't write this down, so I'm trying to think it through as I'm asking it. But there's times where your goals turn out to be a little bit much, right? And you're not going to reach them, but that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'm someone who believes in audacious goals, and I think, and I talk about how narcissism actually helps us set some of them sometimes.
Right.
But I've always been someone who really believes in this idea that, hey, if I decide to set a goal that in the next 5 years I'm going to go to Mars, okay, and I just start working towards that, and 5 years later I'm only at the moon, I'm still at the moon, and everybody else is back on Earth. right? And so I think there's a value in setting audacious goals because it drives you in a direction, and I think there's a value in staying a little bit loose on it. I mean, you keep it in the vision, but you're kind of resolute in the outcome, but flexible in the approach. And I think the approach will sometimes take you different directions. And as long as you feel like it's been a positive and forward moving process. In other words, you are becoming and growing to someone better than you were before. Then that's the goal is accomplished. The audacious end state is simply was the impetus to get you moving and get you started. So I'm always in favor of big audacious big hairy audacious goals. Yeah. So
Yeah. Brendan, I can't see you, so if you have anything to add in, please jump in. If you're,
it's been a while since I heard the BHAG term, so I appreciate you bringing that up, Rich. I agree, and I think in athletics, especially, you hear about the process all the time, right? Like Nick Saban is a famous example. He, capital P process is everything in his program, everything that he works on and focuses on in his program. Now, does that mean that Alabama doesn't have the goal to win a national championship every year and to go undefeated? Of course not. Right? It's their goal every year. But he tries to maintain focus on getting better every day and the incremental steps that will potentially get you there. And like Rich mentioned, if you are getting better every day, that is a goal in and of itself. And so it's important to set short-term, midterm, and long-term goals. And sometimes those long-term goals, like you said, might be a little narcissistic, but they are incredibly important in terms of keeping you on the right azimuth or going in the right direction.
Yeah. And this falls under grit, I'm guessing, right?
Well, a little bit. I mean, it takes grit. I mean, it falls under drive. Again, these attributes, I categorize these attributes just to kind of help make them a little bit more understandable. And I plucked them, or I dumped them into categories that I thought really made sense for the overall definition of them. But they do cross pollinate. I mean, in other words, part of there is self-efficacy involved in grit. There is courage involved in leadership. There's perseverance involved in team ability, right? So but yeah, I think if we're talking about goals, you're going to require almost all of the attributes, at least the first three categories: grit, drive, and mental acuity. All of those will be accessed as you're driving towards a goal. But again, you probably need leadership and team ability as well, because you're probably going to be working with other people. And so we don't necessarily ever accomplish these things on our own. So that those other ones will come into play as well. So I think all of them are at play in any goal that we're achieving.
Yeah. So yeah, you had 5 categories, and they were grit, mental acuity, drive, which self-efficacy is a part of, leadership, and team ability.
Yeah.
And the reason why I asked if that's part of grit is because we were talking about persistence, and which you put with tenacity.
Right.
And then, perseverance is kind of the balance of all of so with persistence, you have to be patient. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then tenacity is an implication of impatience.
Yeah.
Is that right?
They're 3 separate attributes. Perseverance is this constancy in doing something despite difficulty or delay in achieving it, right? So persistence can be described, or perseverance can be described as I'm just pushing through. I'm just constantly pushing through. So in any type of pushing through endeavor, you will be faced with either being sometimes persistent or tenacious. Persistence and tenacious, however, they are separate because they're different, right? Persistence is this kind of stubborn obstinance in I'm going to keep on doing something the same way over and over because I know it's going to work. I know it's right. Right. This is the stonecutter approach. The stonecutter taps that stone 100 times in the same place and then sees nothing. And then the 101st tap, something, it breaks. Right. So that takes persistence. Tenacity, on the other hand, is I'm going to try something. I'm going to endeavor upon something. I'm going to try something. If it doesn't work, I'm going to shift my approach. I'm going to try something new. If that doesn't work, I'm going to shift my approach. I'm going to try something new. Right. That's the car mechanic, right? I'm gonna check the belts. If it's another belts, I'll check the carburetor, so on and so forth. But you can see how you don't want you don't want the tenacious stonecutter. Okay, the tenacious stonecutter will never get the rock carved because he'll keep on tapping different parts of that rock. And the persistent carb mechanic is just going to check the belts and check the belts and check the belts and check the belts, right? So those attributes live on their own, and in some applications they are required as singular attributes. And I think perseverance is just a kind of a holistic. I'm pushing through whatever it takes, whatever it needs to do, whatever I need to do to keep on going. I'm going to do, and that you might be in some cases accessing tenacity, or other cases accessing persistence.
Right. So if Brendan is recruiting a kid, and you notice that he's right-footed and he has a weak left foot, he has to have the attribute of persistence to continually work on that left foot to develop that skill.
Yes,
So,
unless the development requires changing approaches all the time. I mean, I would say he needs a healthy level of perseverance to develop, because unless he has the solution, unless some doctor says, "Hey, listen, your left foot will be developed if you just do this over and over again, guaranteed." Then he needs persistence, right? Just do it over and over until it works, right? But he might be trying to solve the problem, and we say, "Well, I'm going to try this, and that didn't work, so let me try something else." So that didn't work. So you can see how it could require both, depending, yeah.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about a little bit there, Scott, is in the athletic realm anyway. It sounds to me like the difference between individual development and team development, just writ large. Like obviously there are counter examples that you can come up with, but in terms of being persistent, like if you want to develop a particular skill as an athlete, often it's mostly going to be about persistence. We hear about Michael Jordan, and you have to do something 10,000 times to become an expert, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you talk about the team environment, because it's more complex and you have to be more flexible, that requires more of the tenacity. Like, hey, we've been attacking down the right side for 20 minutes here. It ain't working. What's the next thing? Can we shift our focus and try something new? And then if that doesn't work, can we shift our focus and try something new? So I think in terms of the soccer sense anyway, skill development is all about persistence, I would say. Unless you're going to completely change positions. You're like, I'm just not fast enough to be an outside midfielder. I'm going to go be a goalkeeper, which is basically how my career developed. But when it comes to team stuff, there's a huge element of tenacity there. Maybe not quite as much persistence, because you don't want to just keep trying the same thing over and over again. You're going to run out of time. So if it's not working, you got to find a way to kind of shift your focus and do something new.
Right.
Yeah. I like that distinction, and what that distinction allows for me is it allows me to kind of also describe it environmentally, right? The more certain the environment, stable the environment, the more persistence is applicable, versus the less stable, the less predictable the environment, tenacity might be applicable. When you're dealing with teams and other teams and opponents, you're going to be in an environment which is less predictable, and you have to try different approaches. Whereas if you're standing on a free throw line and you just want to learn the skill, right? That environment is fairly stable and predictable, and persistence does win the day. So yeah, I think that's a great distinction.
Yeah, and even within sports, you can see differences. Football is very choreographed. I mean, there is an opponent who is unpredictable, but there's a lot more choreography that goes into it. Soccer's kind of on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah.
So another thing I wanted to talk about was, can attributes be developed? And, you get a baseline of what your attributes are. You offer an assessment that, people can determine where their attributes are. But one thing that I got out of the book was, the more often you throw yourself into environments that require mental and emotional strength, I'll just read it, to get through. So the more you're required to use mental and emotional strength and energy, the more you'll hone your attributes. And actually and you wrote fortitude. I'm sorry. But
fortitude. Yeah, no, it is good. So the answer is yes, you can develop attributes that you're low on. There's three things. There's three criteria that are required to develop an attribute. Okay, one is you have to know you need to develop it. So you have to know you're low. Two is you have to have a motivation or requirement to develop that. And the reason why I say that is because sometimes, depending on the niche you're in, having a low level is exactly where you need to be. In other words, I use the stand up comic. A stand up comic with too much empathy is not going to be a very good stand up comic, right? So just because you're low on something doesn't mean you have to develop it. But if you are in the position, okay, I know I'm low on it. There's a need, there's a motivation, there's a requirement to develop it. And then the third one is the most important. That is, you have to go deliberately find environments that test and tease and develop that attribute, whatever that looks like for you. So I use patience. If you're low on patience and you want to develop your patience, you have to go find environments that test and tease and develop your patience, whatever that might look like. It could be I'm going to deliberately drive in traffic, or I'm going to pick the longest line in the grocery store to stand in. I always say having kids will develop patience, right? But whatever that is, you can do that with any attribute that you're low on. If again there's a need or requirement to do so.
Right. And I feel like, as we're kind of winding down here, that a good story for you to tell, and if you have others, please throw them in there from your experience. But your friend Hank, that you talk about in the book, just how you brought up two different scenarios that he was in where he used his attributes to, just be a rock star, really. So if you could delve into those, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
I
Hank,
think,
Hank was my troop chief, and so he was a senior enlisted guy in my troop. I was the troop commander, and the two chapters I describe, we tell his story in. His first, Perseverance. He had an incident where he had been previously a troop chief and had been relieved and sent home, which is a big deal, and kind of put on penance. And he used his perseverance to actually get through that very kind of tough, dark time, so that he could basically get another shot at being a troop commander, which was when he and I got to work together, and it was obviously phenomenal. So that was one way he really kind of used that perseverance to do that. And then the second chapter that we talk about him was resilience, because after he retired, he began doing some contract work overseas and was in Afghanistan and stepped on a landmine. So he lost both of his legs, double amputee immediately. And that transit, or that journey from getting injured and learning how to walk again, and your whole life obviously has changed. Everything about your life has changed. Is such a story of resilience, of the ability to bounce back to where you were before, right? It's that elasticity of the human being, right? You pull that rubber band and you let go, and it goes back to the original shape. That's resilience, and that resilience is required for both success and failure, because if you can't effectively get back to baseline, you risk, in the failure case, entropy and slowly going down a spiral. In the success case, you risk arrogance and complacency. So that bouncing back and that resilience is incredibly important. And Hank was just a great story to describe that. And obviously a great friend, and we still see each other often. So.
Yeah, you also talk about taking 2 minutes to celebrate something, and 2 minutes to wallow in your sorrow.
That's
basically.
Right. Yeah, the 2-minute rule, and again, the 2-minute rule, which one of my RCOs taught us, is like, okay, if something bad happens, take 2 minutes and again, wallow, kick the dirt, whatever you need to do, then get back to work, right? Get back to baseline, and then if something great happens, take 2 minutes and rest on your laurels and celebrate and do whatever you need to do, pat yourself on the back, and then get back to baseline, right? Now the warning label on that is that's for practicing resilience for small tragedies, like small things. There are things that happen to us that take a lot more than 2 minutes to bounce back from, and there are great things that happen to us that we want to celebrate for a lot more than 2 minutes, right? But you can exercise your resilience muscle with the 2-minute rule on kind of what we call the little tragedies in life, and that's the spat, with the loved one, or the traffic jam, or the hard day at work. Those little things, or the spilt milk. Those little things you can practice resilience and use the 2-minute rule to do so.
Yeah. You talked about Hank and when he was a kid, and his mother, and he dropped a giant gallon of milk all over the floor, and he was expecting to have his hair parted by his mom, and she just kind of said, "Go get the paper towels."
Yep.
So
That's right.
But yeah, the kids that in youth sports, they deal, if a Division I coach isn't giving them a lot of love, then they can take that personally, and it's probably a dangerous slope to take it personally, and just see it more what you're talking about, and the resilience or attribute, and just understanding it's not personal, and that it's an opportunity to find something else, or grow, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Can I throw something in here, Scott? I
Please.
just wanted to make a quick point that idea that resilience works both ways is something that I hadn't thought about, because we so often frame it in a negative way. Like, resilience is getting from low to higher, right? Or getting from low back to baseline. But it also takes a certain amount of resilience to limit yourself to that 2 minutes and bring yourself back to baseline when something great happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a really interesting way to look at resilience, that it's not a one-way street. It's not always about a negative experience that we have to overcome, but sometimes it's about having respect and honoring that baseline and understanding the importance of that baseline and knowing you have to get back to it regardless of what's going on.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, when we had a guy named Jay Demerit on, Rich, who he was on the U.S. men's national team for soccer, but his story was pretty remarkable, that he just decided after college he was going to go make it in English soccer. Mm-hmm. And he started at the very bottom, and there's like 20 different divisions, I think, in English soccer, and he made it all the way to the top. Wow. And he's standing there and at the pinnacle, kind of, and they're playing the songs before the match, and he's just standing there, and he has a TED talk about being prepared for your sunny day, not just a rainy day. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you're talking about, Brendan, is kind of resilience in the less traditional way of thinking about it, possibly. So, Rich, you got any good stories about guys who have wowed you? You talk a bit about jumping out of the back of an airplane, and I know that there are probably things that you can't and won't talk about, but just things that were a good example of just attributes where people you used to work with really just amazed you.
I mean, I guess so many stories. I don't know if I could tell any explicitly, but I will say this. I mean, I was so fortunate to be able to work with a caliber of person that was so kind of so properly indexed on all these attributes, and just such top high performers. And I think that it allowed a few things for me in my life. It allowed me to learn so much about what causes this, and that's really where I got really keyed into and interested in performance and optimal performance, and kind of this whole mastering uncertainty, because I lived it, and I was in it, and I performed it, and I saw guys do just such remarkable things just around me. So that's one. But the other thing, it completely upped my game. It changed my life in a way that I don't know or want to know what my life would be having not done it, because I became something more than I ever imagined I would, because of the people I surrounded myself with. So I think all of us can kind of take this lesson and say, and tell ourselves that we are a reflection of the people we surround ourselves with. And if we choose to surround ourselves with people who we can learn and grow, and people who are actually better than us. I mean, we have to, this is where we put down our ego, but I've always surrounded myself with people who are better than me, and I don't think of I've always had a slight level of imposter syndrome, no matter what I've done. But I use that. For me, that's a goal and a strength, because that means I'm surrounding myself with people who are upping my game. And I think that's the best gift, the greatest gift I was able to come out of a career with. And then of course these distinctions, I love making them. So that's been awesome.
Yeah. Brendan, you got anything else to add?
No, I'm good on this end, other than to say it's been really interesting and enlightening to hear from you, Rob, and I'm glad we had a chance to chat a little bit.
Yeah, well, Brendan, I it's a pleasure. My son is looking to go to William and Mary, so he might see you up there in a year or two. So we're angling that way. So hopefully that'll be the case.
It's a heck of a place.
Good. Yeah, my son's there now, so
good.
Yeah, it is a good place. So guys, thank you. Thanks for sharing all that you guys have been working on, and thanks for all you guys have done for our country too. I never know what the right way to say that is, but thank you.
Yeah.
So
it's all you need. Thank you, friend. That's all you need. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, just want to be respectful of your time too, Rich. So
Cool.
anything else you guys have to add? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up.
All good. All good. I think but yeah, I need to stay on while this kind of make sure it gets uploaded, correct?
So I'll hit stop. Okay.